The colonial-style mansion on Laurel Canyon Boulevard had stood in solemn elegance for decades, its pale stucco walls and ivy-covered columns hiding secrets that only the bravest or most foolish would dare to uncover. To the casual passerby, it was just another grand Hollywood home, once belonging to the legendary Sidney Poitier, a star whose name had been whispered in hushed reverence long after his passing. But for Matthew and Elaine Carter, the house was an opportunity. The Carters were an ambitious couple from New York, eager to escape the monotony of city life and settle into the sun-soaked allure of Los Angeles. Matthew, a screenwriter with a growing reputation, and Elaine, an interior designer with a taste for restoring old estates, saw Poitier's former home as a perfect blend of history and opportunity. They bought it at an enviable price, unaware or perhaps unwilling to believe the rumors surrounding the property. The first few weeks were filled with the usual chaos of moving, unpacking boxes, replacing outdated fixtures, and hosting housewarming dinners for their equally ambitious friends. But beneath the surface of their excitement lurked an unease, a feeling neither of them could quite put into words. At first, it was small things, objects moving from where they had been left, cold drafts despite the mild California weather, a lingering scent of cigars in the library where Poitier had reportedly spent his late nights reading scripts. Then came the voices. Elaine was the first to notice. Late one evening, while sketching renovation plans in the study, she heard soft murmurs, deep, melodic tones, as if someone were reciting lines from an old film. She called out, thinking Matthew had left the TV on in another room. But when she checked, the house was silent. Matthew dismissed her concerns, blaming exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But his skepticism wavered when he began experiencing his own encounters. A persistent knocking at the bedroom door in the dead of night, though no one was there. The sound of footsteps pacing the upstairs hall when Elaine was fast asleep beside him. One night, he awoke to the distinct feeling of being watched, the air thick with something unseen yet undeniably present. The real horror arrived one evening when the couple hosted a small gathering. A friend, a self-proclaimed skeptic, laughed off the ghost stories and jokingly toasted to Poitier's spirit. No sooner had the words left his lips than every light in the house flickered violently. The chandelier above the dining table swayed as if caught in a sudden earthquake, and a framed portrait of the actor, a relic they had kept out of respect, toppled from the fireplace mantel. Silence fell over the room. The guests exchanged nervous glances, their laughter now brittle and uneasy. Determined to put their fears to rest, Elaine delved into the house's history. She uncovered old reports of strange occurrences dating back to the 1980s, long before Poitier's death. Neighbors spoke of lights turning on in the empty house, shadows moving past the windows, and an eerie presence that no previous owner had been able to endure for long. Some believed it was Poitier himself, forever pacing the halls of the home he had loved. Others whispered that something far older resided there, something that had latched onto the house long before the actor's fame. The final straw came one early morning when Elaine, waking before sunrise, found Matthew sitting upright in bed, eyes wide and unseeing. His lips moved, forming words she could not hear, his expression distant, as if listening to someone she could not perceive. When she shook him from his trance, he gasped as though he had been drowning. "We have to leave," he whispered. By the following month, the house was listed once more, its legend growing with every new potential buyer who sensed the inexplicable chill in its air. The Carters refused to speak in detail about their experiences, though the haunted reputation of Sidney Poitier's house only deepened in their wake. As for the next owners, no one stayed for long. The house did not like to be abandoned. When Matthew and Elaine Carter left, they did so in haste, their possessions packed in a rush, leaving behind things they had once cherished, books still stacked on the library shelves, a pair of Elaine's pearl earrings forgotten on the marble countertop, a single leather loafer of Matthew's inexplicably missing its twin. Their real estate agent assured them that a new buyer would come soon. After all, homes of such grandeur, in such a coveted part of Los Angeles, were always in demand. But weeks passed, then months, and still no one moved in. The house stood empty, but it was not still. The ivy continued its slow, creeping ascent along the stucco walls. its tendrils wrapping around the balcony railings like fingers grasping for something unseen. The great bay windows, once polished to a gleam by the Carters, seemed to darken from within, the glass smudged and dim no matter how often it was cleaned. A fine layer of dust settled across the floors, though no one walked them. Yet the house breathed, its wooden beams groaning in the night, its doors shifting ever so slightly, as if adjusting to an invisible weight. And then the McAllisters arrived. Jason and Lillian McAllister had been searching for a home in Los Angeles for nearly a year, frustrated by overpriced listings and soulless modern constructions that all felt the same. When their agent mentioned a historic estate with a troubling past but a remarkable price, they dismissed the rumors as exaggerated gossip. "Ghosts don't pay the mortgage," Jason had joked, standing in the vast, echoing foyer, his voice swallowed by the high, vaulted ceilings. Lillian, less convinced but unwilling to appear superstitious, trailed her fingers along the curved banister of the grand staircase. The wood was smooth, polished from decades of touch, and yet, beneath her fingertips, it felt oddly warm as though someone had only just withdrawn their hand. The house smelled of age, of forgotten things buried in time. There was a lingering scent, too, something richer, more intimate cigar smoke, barely perceptible but unmistakable, curling in the air like an unfinished sentence. They signed the papers within the week. For the first few days, the McAllisters convinced themselves that the house was merely adjusting to its new inhabitants, just as they were adjusting to it. The occasional flicker of lights, the strange way their dog, an old Labrador named Benny, refused to enter the library, the persistent sense of being watched from the upper landing, none of it seemed alarming at first. Lillian dismissed the drafts as a symptom of an old house. Jason joked that Benny was just lazy, choosing to lie in the sun-drenched living room rather than venture into darker corners. But the nights were different. The house creaked in ways that felt deliberate. Footsteps echoed down the hall when no one was walking. The whispering began again, soft, measured words in a voice neither of them recognized. Sometimes so quiet they strained to hear, other times so loud it woke them from sleep. One night, Jason sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around his legs, his breath coming fast and shallow. Lillian stirred beside him, mumbling drowsily. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. She turned her head against the pillow. "Hear what?" His eyes flicked toward the open bedroom door. The hallway beyond was dark, but the air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. "It was right outside the door," he said. Lillian listened. The house was silent now, oppressively so, as if holding its breath. "Go back to sleep," she murmured, but her voice held no conviction. Jason lay back down, staring at the ceiling, his body rigid beneath the covers. He did not sleep. The next morning, Lillian found the library door wide open, though she was certain she had locked it the night before. The air inside was thick with that same scent, cigars and something deeper, something older, something she could not name. Benny stood at the threshold, his body rigid, his hackles raised. She did not step inside. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was swallowed by shadow, Jason discovered something else. The framed portrait above the fireplace, the same one that had fallen during the Carters' gathering, had shifted. It hung askew, though neither of them had touched it. Jason reached out, gripping the frame's edge, meaning to straighten it. But as his fingers met the glass, a chill shot up his arm, an icy jolt that made him recoil as if burned. He turned to Lillian, his voice tight. "We shouldn't be here." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. But outside, beyond the tall, curtained windows, the ivy continued to climb. The house was waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house settled into them like a slow-moving tide, creeping into the spaces between their thoughts, coiling around their habits, breathing in their silences. The McAllisters tried, at first, to resist its influence, to live as they had before. They went about their days with careful normalcy. Jason made coffee in the mornings while reading the news on his tablet. Lillian busied herself with decorating, hanging swatches of fabric against the walls, deciding on colors that might make the house feel less other. But the house did not want to be changed. The paint she chose, a warm ivory meant to brighten the dim corridors, peeled at the corners by morning. The nails she drove into the walls to hang paintings, scenic landscapes, chosen to counteract the mansion's heavy, brooding presence loosened of their own accord, the frames crashing to the floor in the middle of the night. And every morning, without fail, that portrait above the fireplace tilted. She tested it once. One evening, she straightened it with meticulous precision, running her hand along the frame's edges until it was perfectly level. Then she took a photo, time-stamped, indisputable. The next morning, she awoke to find it not only askew again, but its glass cracked, a single jagged line running from corner to corner. The house was watching. Jason, ever the rationalist, refused to acknowledge the weight that settled over them, the feeling of unseen eyes tracking their movements. He dismissed the whispers, the footsteps in the hallway, the peculiar way Benny refused to go upstairs. But he could not ignore the dreams. They began subtly fragments of images, half-formed sensations that vanished upon waking. But soon they grew vivid, urgent. Jason found himself trapped in endless corridors, walking through rooms that stretched unnaturally long, their walls shifting, closing in around him. Sometimes he stood in the library, his hands moving through the air as if holding a script, his mouth forming words he could not understand. Always, he awoke with the taste of smoke on his tongue. And then, the night of the mirror. Lillian had gone to bed early, weary from another day of trying and failing to impose her will upon the house. Jason lingered in the study, staring at his laptop screen, a screenplay draft open but untouched. His thoughts felt scattered, disjointed, slipping through his grasp like water. The room smelled of old books and leather, but beneath it, something lingered that sent again, the unmistakable trace of cigars. A soft creak sounded from the hallway. He stiffened, turning toward the open door. The hallway was dark, the overhead light casting long shadows that flickered and stretched unnaturally, like something just out of sight was moving through them. He exhaled sharply, pushing himself up from the desk, his breath shallow. He stepped into the hall. The air was colder here, dense in a way that pressed against his skin. At the far end of the corridor, the antique mirror Lillian had hung days before an elegant, silver-framed thing she had found in a West Hollywood boutique reflected the dim glow of the study's light. But something was wrong. He moved closer, his heart pounding in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The mirror was old, slightly warped, its surface fogged with a patina of age. Yet within its reflection, Jason did not see himself as he should have. His face was there, his eyes wide, his lips slightly parted, but behind him beside him stood a figure, tall, imposing, its features blurred as if the mirror could not hold its image, could not translate it into something human. But Jason could feel it, the weight of its presence, its breath close to his ear. And then it moved. Jason staggered backward, his heel catching the edge of the rug. His shoulder hit the wall, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. The mirror reflected only him, but the scent of cigars was stronger now, clinging to his skin. He did not return to the study that night. Lillian noticed the change in him immediately. He was quieter, his movements careful, measured, as if expecting something to reach out from the walls. He did not tell her about the mirror. He convinced himself it had been a trick of the dim light, a mind exhausted from stress and lack of sleep. But the house knew. Days later, the mirror shattered. Not with a crash, not in some dramatic explosion of glass, but in silence. Lillian found it one morning, the cracks splintering outward like veins, as if something had pressed against it from the other side. She did not replace it. And in the nights that followed, Jason woke to find himself standing again in the library, his fingers grazing the spines of old books, his lips moving in silent dialogue. But when he looked down at the desk, he saw a script he had not written. The ink was faded, the pages brittle with age, and the title scrawled in neat, deliberate script. Sidney Poitier. The house would not let him go. Jason did not tell Lillian about the script. He should have. Instead, he told himself that he had written it in a daze, that the weight of the house, its whispers and shadows, had burrowed so deeply into his mind that he had crafted something without realizing it. That was the only explanation. It had to be. But the script was wrong. The handwriting was not his. The paper itself was not from his office. The pages yellowed, edges curled. Ink faded as if time had aged them beyond their years. Yet when he flipped through them, something inside him lurched with recognition. It was a story about a man who had built a life out of words, who had spent his years chasing an idea of himself that others had shaped. A man who had walked through rooms filled with applause but had never quite felt at home in them. And at the end of the script, in the last scene, a man sitting in a house, alone. Jason closed the pages, his breath uneven. That night he dreamed. He stood in the library, but it was not his library. The furniture was different, the desk older, the walls lined with books he did not recognize. And across from him, in a leather chair bathed in the glow of a dying fire, sat a figure. Sidney Poitier, or at least something wearing his shape. The figure exhaled a slow breath, tendrils of cigar smoke curling into the dim light. His eyes dark, deep, endless studied Jason in a way that made his skin prickle. "You stayed longer than the others," the figure said. His voice was smooth, rich, but laced with something heavier. Jason swallowed. His throat was dry. "Why am I here?" The figure's lips curled into something like amusement. "Because the house knows you," he said simply. "And you know the house." Jason shook his head. "I don't belong here." The figure leaned forward slightly. "Don't you?" The fire crackled. The shadows on the walls lengthened. Jason felt something tightening around him, an unseen weight pressing against his chest, his ribs. "You've written about me," the figure said. "But the question is, will you write for me?" Jason's mouth went dry, because he understood. The whispers, the footsteps, the shifting portrait, the way the house refused to let him leave, not physically, but mentally. The house did not want a resident. It wanted a storyteller. The figure smiled, slow and knowing. Jason bolted upright in bed. The air was thick with the scent of smoke. Beside him, Lillian stirred, murmuring his name, but he was already moving, throwing off the covers, stumbling toward the door. He could hear something, feel something calling to him from the library. He stopped himself just in time. This was how it happened. This was how it kept them. He turned, grabbed Lillian by the wrist. "We have to leave. Now." She blinked, half asleep, confused. "Jason, what?" "Now, Lillian." His voice was sharp, urgent, and she must have seen something in his face, some deep and silent terror, because she did not argue. They did not pack. They did not turn off the lights. They simply left. As Jason slammed the car door shut, hands trembling on the wheel, he caught one last glimpse of the house through the rearview mirror. The library window was lit, though they had left no lights on. And behind the glass, a shadow sat in the chair, watching. The house did not stop them. But Jason knew it was not finished with him. And somewhere, deep in the pit of his mind, a single thought took root, curling like ivy through his consciousness. The script is waiting. They never went back. The McAllisters moved into a high-rise apartment downtown, glass walls and city lights replacing the heavy, brooding presence of the house. Lillian never spoke of it again. She buried herself in the routines of normal life, filling their new space with bright colors, modern furniture, and the hum of music that never quite drowned out the silence between them. Jason tried to do the same, but the script followed him. It started with small things, words scrawled in the margins of his notebooks, ideas that came unbidden in the quiet hours of the night. He would wake with lines of dialogue running through his mind, entire scenes playing behind his eyes as if he had seen them before. One evening, while sorting through boxes they had hastily packed from the old house, he found it. The script. He had been certain he left it behind. The paper was brittle beneath his fingers, the ink still faint but unmistakable. He ran his thumb over the title, his breath unsteady. Sidney Poitier. He should have burned it. But instead, Jason sat at his desk, the glow of the city casting long shadows across the walls, and turned the first page. Outside, in the distance, a horn blared. A voice from the street below called out, lost in the noise of the world moving on. But inside, the air changed. The faintest trace of cigar smoke curled into the room. And Jason picked up his pen. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.